actually passing reforms that improve the process often prove difficult to achieve, and the question is why. And we have heard a lot of things about that yesterday already. So in the same context, and that we also had a full panel yesterday evening about, is the context of take-up of electoral recommendations to improve elections is very low, even in mostly democratic countries, like also within the European Union. You heard the example yesterday of Germany, where they never take up any recommendations, or very, very randomly. So, and finally, the current discussion and research tends to focus on the content of electoral reform, so what it is we would like to reform. Most of the time it's centered around electoral systems and the effects of the electoral law around it. But there has been virtually nothing on the process of reform, looking at who should be involved, when should it take place, and how can consensus be reached between actors, and how does this affect electoral quality. Okay, we're already on the next slide. Good. So now you're faster than I am. So when we look at the electoral reform process, we find a complex set of dynamics I just would like to line out here, and challenges. And I'm just picked the 6 top ones, like a selection, top selection one, and I would like to just go through them with you very quickly. So a lack of political will relegates reform processes to a window dressing exercise, and we all have seen that. Sometimes there is reform happening or the take-up of recommendation, and it's just that they have done something. It does not really be a reform, or it doesn't lead to any changes in the power structures. So the second one is reforms are conducted opaquely among a small set of elite actors, excluding key stakeholders in population. And we all have seen this, and we refer to this a little bit lapidar once in a while, is the Friday 5 o'clock agreements, where not everybody who is supposed to be in parliament is in the room, and decisions are taken without anybody really knowing about what the decision is taken upon. So the third one is electoral reform takes place too late in the electoral cycle. We see this very often as well. There is this magical timeline of not doing any reform 1 year prior, but that still happens all the time. And this has the problem that these sort of changes send shockwaves to all the stakeholders. And everybody needs to prepare, candidates, political parties, even the citizens, and they are not in the position anymore to do this if the reform comes too short. And most importantly, for election commissions, they are not able anymore to address the changes adequately as they should. So reforms are based on short-term reactive thinking that produces unintended consequences. We see this very often, unfortunately, as well as a project-based thinking, looking for the low-hanging fruit. So you change one thing without actually seeing the bigger picture, which can lead to massive problems afterwards. Reforms are manipulated to tilt the playing field in favor of those in power. I don't need to comment. And reforms are premised on misinformation or a lack of knowledge about the nature of underlying problems. So you change something and you don't really know what it is you really want to change, and that can lead to even more problems afterwards. Next slide, please. Okay. So the question is, which role does the process of electoral reform play in improving electoral integrity? And that's the central question we were asking ourselves when we developed these principles. So not every reform process automatically improves elections and electoral integrity, as I have shown in the 6 top selection problems we have. So we can conclude that the way electoral reform processes are conducted has implications for the integrity of elections. So the process, how to do it, is as important as what to do. So what kind of process improves the integrity and the trust in elections? That's the actual question we need to ask here. And it's assumed, based on the analysis that we did so far, that if the process better reflects democratic principles, and it is more likely to improve the election process for all citizens and increase trust. So the reform needs to follow democratic principles. That's the key message. Next slide, please. So now I'm introducing the Global Network to you, which is the organization with which we actually invented these principles. So the Global Network was formed during the first Summit for Democracy in 2021. And following several global sessions of interested organizations, we launched it publicly in 23. So it convenes election stakeholders around shared vision to inspire and inform action to advance electoral integrity in the face of critical threats to democracy. So we're looking what are the threats, and then we combine our knowledge. So the global network aims at being a as globally representatives as possible, and representing a great diversity of regional and stakeholder organizations. Right now we have 20 members, and it's a truly global network. Some of your observer organizations are part of it as well, as is NDI and IFES. And we are benefiting from the experience and the dedication of these 20 global members. So at the end of 23, the members decided to look at electoral reform to the challenging dynamics we saw on global levels. So electoral reform was the first topic we picked. And then during 24, the global working group set out to develop a document that focuses on the process, not the content of the reform, a document that is based on a consensus among a wide range of stakeholders on a global level, and that provides a set of principles and approaches for the electoral reform process that helps to improve the integrity. As we heard before, reform is not always positive. It does not always improve the integrity. So, to base the document on a broad understanding of the issues, the members of the working group globally contacted all their counterparts through surveys, interviews, focus groups. So within a period of 6 months, we got 60 responses from election management bodies, political parties, civil society, parliaments, voila. and NGOs all over the globe. So we can say this document I will shortly present to you is based on global input. It is a document everybody looked at, everybody looked into it and gave their input. Okay, so we're already on the last slide. So these principles are meant to be applied, these 6 principles we developed are meant to be applied and adapted in any given political context and reform type. Constitutional reform, legislative reform, procedural reform, policy reform. So they're universal for this. They're supposed to be a guidepost for electoral reform processes, and they shall help to establish a process that creates trust among stakeholders. That's what they are there for. So the aim was to have an advocacy tool for all stakeholders that can help to work towards a democratic reform process. And I hope that this is something we discussed yesterday. What do we have as a tool for CSOs to give to them to take reform forward? And I hope that this is one of them. So now I will briefly line out these 6 principles. So the first one is political consensus building is foundational to any reform process. So as electoral reform is inherently political, and I can't stress this enough, electoral reform is not a technical issue, it's a political issue, specifically when we look at changes of the system. It can quickly be overtaken by narrow interests, and this is something we need to keep in mind. So without genuine consensus, it's far easier for narrow interests to hijack the process, and you could end up with reforms that actually hurt transparency or exclude people if you don't do it right. So to avoid this pitfall, the process itself needs to try to minimize polarization, encourage good faith discussions, and that means really digging into the challenges inclusively with all of them. Name the challenges, have everybody take part in it. Look at the political incentives, defining clear goals and broad input, and making sure it's all based on evidence, not on opinion. This is also very important because you can't find consensus on opinion. Secondly, electoral reform processes should be transparent. That means that independent oversight organizations, like election observers for that matter, or also opposition parties, should have sufficient access to monitor the electoral reform process. There should be transparency around the motivation and the goal for reform. So why are we doing it? What are we heading for? The timeline and the level of the reform process. So we do this in how many years? Is there anything happening prior to the next election or not? Who will be involved in the reform process? Like who leads it? It doesn't necessarily have to be an election management body, it can be somebody else. The source of funding, because these things do cost money, and the content of the reform. This is also very important. And then thirdly, electoral reform processes should be inclusive. And that means while the degree and breadth of consultation may vary based on the type and level of reform, as I said, constitutional, legislative, procedural. Every type of reform needs to have a consultative process and inclusive means in place. And these are the mechanisms we spoke about yesterday that are still missing with the weak institutions, that we don't have a mechanism to actually take the recommendations forward and to do a next step. This is what it will be. So actively seeking out those voices, facilitating broad input, making sure all main political society actors are at the table. And here is a key point: socialize the ideas of reform within society. Not only NGOs or civil society, socialize it within the wider public so people have an informed voice they can participate with. Number 4, electoral reform should be informed by evidence and long-term vision. We heard that yesterday as well. So electoral reform should be designed with a vision that extends beyond the immediate electoral cycle and creates a solid foundation that will keep the democratic system resilient even when those currently in power leave. So what we don't want is changes every 5 years. So in this context, high quality and well-presented information is important, and this sort of evidence needs to be agreed by everybody. Having said that, we have the Afrobarometer is, for example, a good source of evidence everybody agrees upon. So, number 5, democratic electoral reform process requires adequate timeframes and resources. And we just spoke about the 12-month thing. It needs to be longer. It depends on what kind of reform you do. If you do constitutional reform, usually it's 3 years, 4 years, I would say, potentially even more than one electoral cycle. Procedural reform is a few months, but you should stay outside of this 1-year rule. And then last but not least, number 6 is clear accountability structures are essential for electoral reform. They allow for public scrutiny and ensure that decisions are not taken at the expense of the broader public interest. And it's important that ambiguity around accountability structures leads to flawed processes. We end up in a situation where Department A shifts to Department B and vice versa, and no decisions are taken. So this accountability, the clear structure of accountability is very important. So yeah. And here is the website where you can download the principles with all the explanations and all the background information as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tanja, for the presentation. I think it was quite insightful. We'll now move on to the next panelist. Opening remarks from Reverend Derek Marco. Reverend, as you give your opening remarks, I would appreciate it if you could also just address the question on this particular question. Given that EMBs are at the center of this law confidence, the law confidence that Dr. Dulani presented, what specific reforms are necessary to reverse the trend and to restore the trust, and who should spearhead these reforms? You can just touch on this as you provide your opening remarks. Thank you. Yeah, you can, whichever way you're comfortable.
Good morning, everybody. It's good to be here, good to participate in this discussion, rebuilding trust and advancing reform. I am going to make a few comments at the end about the two presentations, but I just want to take you back 30 years. It's 1994, it's the 27th of April, 1994. We hold the election in South Africa, and we regard that as a new age. Democracy, freedom, liberation, and emancipation takes place. The rule of law will prevail. All of these things are in our head, and the vehicle through which the system is delivered is free and fair elections. The elections were more than just a delivery of a new system. It also served as a conflict deterrent at that time, a powerful mobilizing of energies of people into a direction that can provide peace. That's what it was. 1994, 30 years ago. And I think what happened in South Africa almost served as a springboard for many other countries in Africa as well to just build and continue to build. But in reality, when we look back, and I think this is the value of looking back, it was neutralizing the forces and drivers of fundamental change and introducing a system of political democracy where the people could elect who would govern. It overturned the racial divides and systems of separation, introduced systems evolving out of the elections and the new constitution. But while it introduced all of that, we were also in a situation that we didn't fully understand. And that situation, I think, was driven by our understanding of democracy and the things that we were doing at the time, and neoliberalism that was also emerging and has now taken root completely. A notion of this neoliberalism from the West was solidly in place, and it overtook us cutting across state boundaries and hoarding up monies in safe havens, and while supposedly locking down tax boundaries for some, the super rich just outsmarted us completely. They bought the young intellectuals of the struggle and made them capitalists overnight. And they took the most vocal and visible fighters who walked the roads of new democracies and gave them shares, lots of it for very poor people at the time, and basically bought them over to become the defenders of democracy and the face of this dispensation. And so, colleagues, when I talk to you about this background, it's something that our colleague yesterday, what's the prof's name, also mentioned. It is a background where we're almost operating in two distinct worlds. One where we embraced the notion of democracy and what it offered, and another one, another world that was just operating way beyond the context in which we were functioning. The reality were two worlds of glorified promises and heightened expectations on the one hand, and another world, another reality of globalized corporate systemic control of economies that transcended and still transcends national boundaries. And these new democracies 30 years down the line cannot hold because it cannot take us beyond the promises. And so government institutions, they got bogged down with their own meltdowns. They melted down. In South Africa is a classic example from 1994 to where we are today, a complete meltdown in our system. And what we see at the surface, failing institutions, lack of delivery, corruption, as well as increased criminality at sophisticated levels, syndicates, extortion, syndicate drug cartels, and a whole host of despicable forces of destruction is in fact democracy that could not deliver on the promises and the dreams. And I pause for a moment. Citizens, on the other hand, we are forced to keep the democracy intact, largely by participating in elections that are free, transparent, fair, expressing the will of the people. But the same citizens are also experiencing the consequences of doing this. A disastrous calamity of total collapse in a system that is outdated. And recent studies show that the newer generations, our young, vibrant, and our young, vibrant youth, they are living in these contradictions. They are hypercritical of many of these systems, of which democracy is an example or a cornerstone of it. And we need to understand this if we explore what we want to be doing with trust in the democratic process. So how do we ask the question of trust and reform for the betterment of citizens in terms of outward manifestations is to deal with a lack of, but also in terms of the deeper inward knowledge is to deal with the contradictions of outdated political systems and economic realities. And so let me say something about the Afrobarometer very quickly. I think it is one of the smartest barometers, and if I can have a little thing in my head, I was the director of IDASA at the time when we launched Afrobarometer. So I'm very proud of Afrobarometer itself. But, you know, when we started the Afrobarometer, we wanted to measure democracy as a transitional, as we were transitioning into this new democracy. And we were testing people's opinions, how they were fitting in, and how they were appreciating the space that we were in. And it remains, I think it's a system that measures democracy, but I think it's a system that also allows us to begin to see the contradictions of democracy itself. And I would like more of those questions to surface as you move along. And so with regard to when you ask me trust and support, then I don't have an answer. I don't know. I really don't know. I have seen a country like South Africa falling apart. I've been there. I've walked every election. I've walked every process. I've seen how government collapsed. And on the one hand, it is the failure of the state, I think, of many of the people. But on the other hand, there were just so many forces that has impacted on our democracy. On the Electoral Commission itself, I was a staff member of the Electoral Commission until I retired 3 years ago. And I can say to you that the Electoral Commission in South Africa is still one of the best electoral commissions in terms of robust, everything that we put in place. But if you put that commission alongside all the destructive forces that plays itself out, then you see how the levels of trust actually falls apart. I was in Zimbabwe in 2023, and I'm just a total outsider looking in. I saw an electoral commission collapsing completely under the pressure of political forces. And so when we have a discussion about electoral commissions and how we need to transform those things, colleagues, we need to be very conscious of the fact that there are forces that are working against these commissions at a level that way surpasses all the inputs that we are making. And if I move, I lived in Nigeria for 7 years. I worked with the Electoral Commission out there. When the chairperson of the Electoral Commission says, I have 50,000 people that I can manage, but then the rest of my people I don't have no control over because there are many other things that are happening, then that's an Electoral Commission that has an understanding of processes, that rolls out things, but there are political forces that plays itself out. So, measuring people's interest and support in relation to trust, I think there's a whole lot of other things. I've got a very interesting acronym, but I'll mention it later on. It's called ALIEN. I'll mention it later on. Thank you very much.
Interesting. Thank you so much, Reverend. I think you brought in an interesting perspective. You know, when we think about elections, some of us think if we deal with our institutions, we strengthen them, then we'll be good. But Reverend is saying there are other external factors that we ought to consider. And I think this is what we are going to talk about as we go on with the discussion. But at this point, please allow me to invite Abera, one of our panelists, to also give us some insights, particularly from a regional perspective, providing examples from East and Horn of Africa. Could you please just give us your opening remarks? Thank you. And then after your presentation, you can just take a seat with the other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to say about elections and democracy in Africa. I can't agree more than the previous speakers. And Afrobarometer has flagged out and showcased the situation in Africa. I wanted to raise additional issue which might stimulate discussions among ourselves. The trust issue is a critical issue, which I believe in, that if people do not have trust on the electoral management body and feel that there is fraud, manipulation, and lack of transparency, definitely people will never go out to vote. But for me, there is also another factor, and I will try to give you an example, empirical example, in my country, Ethiopia. I came from Ethiopia, and I know the situation in Ethiopia very well. In Ethiopia, we have had 6 rounds of elections, and in all 6 rounds of elections, the dominant party had a sweeping victory. And although there were 2 dominant parties, one was dissolved, and the successor continued in the last election to win all seats, almost all seats in the parliament, which is 547. So there is no hope of alteration of power, or there is no plurality of voices in that parliament. So a single voice is dominating the discourse, or a single party views is shaping laws, and so on and so forth. Or this is the major thing which I didn't find in the Afrobarometer assessment. In Ethiopia, you have a dominant party having 60 million people who spend 1.3 billion Ethiopian birr, compared to the second largest, which spend 120 million only, and has a structure across the country. On the other hand, you have fragmented, small political parties. They are ethnically divided, they are understaffed, they are underfunded. And so there is a lopsided, the electoral landscape is lopsided. It gives a free ride for the dominant party. So the outcome is predictable. So this is a situation we should look into, because it's not only a trust. Why did people lose trust on electoral democracy? If there is no change in power, alternation of power, then why should they go out and really put their ballot at the ballot box to rubber stamp the electoral process? So without even, without even manipulating, rigging, the dominant party can have a sweeping win, because it has a structure, it has ability of mobilizing the rural people, and it's inevitable that they can win almost all seats. So this is an important area which would really probe. And the second thing is, this is an issue of hope. If political parties do not aspire for power, and if there is no prospect that they will win, they will dissolve. So this would be resulting in this disenfranchisement. It's very, very important for us. So hope is another, that's important thing we should really consider. People must aspire, at least see some hope that there will be a change in the political powers, seizure of political power, new parties will come, solve their problems. So this is an important issue worth considering. The second one is the election dividend. Why do people come out to vote? If election does not reward them, shows them the change in their lives, at least an incremental way, or gives them hope, then it will be a futile exercise to go out every 4 years or 5 years and cast ballot. So these important things are worth considering when we think about reform. How are going to really change the electoral landscape, the political landscape? How do we really make a balance between the dominant parties and the small, fragmented, ethnically divided political parties? These are important challenges for us really to address it. Otherwise, we'll go out every 5 or 4 years, and then the winner is already predetermined. We know who will be winning, and that would be the futile exercise. So I think it's important to really also consider these factors. Apart, loss of trust on the election management body, hope is very important, and the electoral landscape is also another issue to be considered, so as to really give hope for people, citizens, to go out and vote. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think another interesting perspective, when election processes are rigged, then hope is lost. When election outcomes are predetermined, then what's the use? Why should we go for elections if elections are going to be rigged? And that's the very important, point that Abera raised with us. Our last panelist is Omi. Omi is going to present. Her presentation is going to be in French, but we are going to have translation in the process. Thank you.
Merci, Madame la modératrice. Bonjour à tout le monde. Donc, je suis Oumi, je viens du Sénégal et je suis membre de Wayon. Donc, je vais me projeter sur le sujet en essayant de répondre aux questions qui ont été posées par Madame la modératrice. Donc, je reviens d'abord sur l'analyse critique donc, du diagnostic.
Permettez qu'on ait un son parce qu'ils n'ont pas les écouteurs.
Ah, ok.
Yeah. So since we don't have the material, we'll have to take turns. So she says her name is Umi, and she'll present on the board and she'll try to answer to the question the moderator asked by presenting an analysis.
Donc, pour le diagnostic sur la crise de confiance des citoyens par rapport aux organes de gestion des élections, je reviens pour dire qu'il y a un problème de crédibilité qui se pose parce que les organes de gestion des élections sont souvent donc nommés par les pouvoirs publics. La composition laisse à désirer, même la représentation, elle est encore critiquable.
So she says when it comes to trust, the biggest challenge is the fact that electoral commissions are nominated by the state, and even the compositions of the same commissions are questionable.
Sur la participation citoyenne, on peut dire qu'elle n'est pas du tout inclusive parce qu'on ne prend pas en compte les différents groupes d'acteurs sociaux.
So when it comes to participation, we don't see inclusivity because we do not consider the different social groups.
Il y a aussi la question de la communication qui pose problème parce qu'on ne communique avec les électeurs que sur les techniques de vote, alors que sur l'ensemble du processus, les électeurs ne suivent pas les questions qui se posent pour pouvoir apporter les réformes nécessaires.
We also have a communication problem because we only talk about voting technique rather than the process in its entirety. That's one key issue we have to address.
Nous avons aussi relevé comme défi aujourd'hui la persistance de la manipulation et de la désinformation en période électorale.
Too many disinformation and manipulation takes place, and we really need to address it as well.
En ce qui concerne l'impact de la faible confiance qui peut conduire aussi à des situations très dramatiques comme les coups d'État, par exemple, nous avons noté que de plus en plus, les chefs d'État qui sont encore candidats pour les élections présidentielles ont l'habitude de choisir les personnes avec qui ils veulent aller en compétition.
The other problem we see due to the lack of trust, this most often leads to a coup d'etat. We have situations where the leaders in power would also choose the people that are going to stand against them in the elections.
Je pense que le dernier en date, c'est celui de la Guinée-Bissau, où le principal leader de l'opposition a été écarté. Le même phénomène s'est observé aussi récemment en Côte d'Ivoire, où les deux barons de l'opposition ont été écartés.
We've seen the same issues in Ivory Coast and Guinea-Bissau, where the principal opposing parties have been set aside by the government in power.
Dans ce registre, il faut aussi relever que les climats sociopolitiques sont souvent tendus pendant les périodes qui précèdent les élections.
It is also worth noting that the socio-political climate is quite tense prior to elections.
il y a eu beaucoup de manifestations au niveau des citoyens par rapport à la cherté de la vie, par rapport aux questions de santé, d'éducation. C'est beaucoup de problèmes qui se posent et qui entraînent souvent aussi une recrudescence des violations des droits de l'homme.
There was many strikes by citizens due to health-related problems, education, and others, which creates more tension in the same political environment.
Et c'est ça qui conduit à des arrestations arbitraires, à des détentions illégales et des pertes en vie humaine aussi qui sont enregistrées. Et ce qui fait que beaucoup de jeunes, comme beaucoup d'opposants, se retrouvent en prison.
And this is how we have targeted arrests. We also have loss of life and many injustices that take place in the country.
Ceci dit que donc la résilience au niveau des peuples a des limites. Et si on ne fait pas le cloisonnement entre l'aspiration du parti au pouvoir et l'aspiration du peuple, donc ça fausse le jeu démocratique.
This is why resilience is at risk, because if we do not close the gap between the government in power's expectation and the people's expectation, these are problems we might as well face.
Maintenant, il y a un rôle déterminant que doivent jouer les communautés économiques régionales pour pouvoir accompagner la stabilité de nos pays.
So there is a critical role for regional committees to take in order for us to advance forward.
Mais malheureusement, ces communautés économiques manquent de crédibilité.
But sadly, these regional communities lack credibility.
Parce que souvent, même dans les déclarations délivrées lors de l'observation électorale, c'est toujours les mêmes contenus.
Because even during the declarations in election period, it's always the same contents that comes back.
Et c'est souvent donc la perception des citoyens, c'est de rejeter ces déclarations.
And the perception of citizens is to reject the said declaration that come back.
Moi, je pense que les communautés économiques régionales devraient plutôt jouer de la diplomatie préventive.
And so I believe regional communities should play a preventive role to these issues.
Anticiper sur tous les problèmes qui existent au niveau des acteurs pour pouvoir aussi apporter des solutions consensuelles.
Anticipate the problems that may arise in the stakeholders and also provide potential solutions.
Mais aussi délivrer des positions très claires qui vont dans l'intérêt des citoyens.
And also define their position in a clear manner that goes into the interest of the people.
Maintenant, sur le thème 2, qui revient sur les questions de la confiance et des principes, je pense que c'est des solutions qu'on pourrait proposer. Donc, c'est de revenir vraiment sur un programme d'éducation électorale axé sur la citoyenneté.
Sorry, I lost you there.
Je dis sur le thème 2, donc, sur les solutions qu'on pourrait proposer, c'est de mettre en place un programme d'éducation électorale.
And the solutions we might propose would be to put an educational program on electoral processes,
mais aussi de permettre aux citoyens
but also to allow citizens
de participer au débat politique public.
to participate to public debate, political public
Donc,
debates,
c'est de renforcer leur capacité sur tous les processus,
reinforce their capacities on all processes,
de leur permettre de mieux connaître les questions qui sont posées par les acteurs,
to allow them to better understand
les
the questions that
comprendre.
are asked by the actors,
de les analyser
to understand them, analyze
et de
them,
pouvoir aussi donner leurs idées.
but also share their own ideas.
Mais aussi, il faudrait renforcer les capacités des organisations de la société civile
We need to reinforce the capacities of civil society as
dans
well
le monitoring des processus électoraux
in the monitoring of electoral processes.
et renforcer aussi le plaidoyer
Reinforce as well
pour combattre la corruption
the different plea to combat, to
et
fight
promouvoir la
against corruption
transparence
and promote to promote balance
et l'intégrité électorale.
of the electoral integrity.
Dans beaucoup de nos pays, on a ce qu'on appelle le vote des consciences, l'achat des consciences qui peut se faire avant les élections avec les transferts d'électeurs. Vous êtes nommé à des postes stratégiques, vous venez, vous prenez des milliers de personnes que vous allez faire voter, par exemple à Dakar, alors que ces personnes n'habitent pas à Dakar. c'est beaucoup de problèmes d'achat de conscience qu'il faut combattre parce que au niveau local, par exemple pour les élections locales, aujourd'hui, il y a des groupes de citoyens, par exemple à Dakar, qui commencent à les identifier et à combattre cette pratique que les politiciens sont en train de faire.
There's a practice that the people has been fighting recently is where we are trying to get their buy-in, but again at the same time we'll see the political people in power taking people from the province and bringing them to the capital to cast their votes, but they are not from there, which doesn't make sense.
Pour les réformes nécessaires, moi je pense qu'aujourd'hui, les organes de gestion des élections doivent être des administrations publiques fortes qui représentent les intérêts et les besoins des citoyens.
For new reforms, we need to ensure that electoral committees represent the interest of the people.
Il faudrait aussi engager des discussions avec les citoyens et susciter leur adhésion. Par exemple, par rapport au cadre juridique, par rapport au financement des candidats, au financement de la campagne, etc.
We need to approach citizens and get their opinion on different aspects, the financial aspect of candidates and many several aspects, having their opinion.
Il faudrait aussi, comme nous sommes à l'ère du numérique aujourd'hui, développer des initiatives innovantes pour faire entendre les opinions et les contributions des citoyens.
We also need new solutions that are more modern and use digital means to communicate with the people.
Mais nous devons aussi promouvoir une citoyenneté éclairée, valorisée et dotée d'un pouvoir d'action.
But also we need to empower our citizens so that they are able to act on their opinions.
Mais surtout travailler à faciliter l'exercice des droits et des libertés individuelles parce que de plus en plus l'espace civique est réduit dans nos pays.
But also to work hard so that every citizen's right is respected, even though the situation is that the civic space has been reduced.
Il y a aussi la question de l'inclusion et de l'intersectionnalité qui est important avec la participation des femmes, des jeunes, des groupes vulnérables, des personnes vivant sous handicap.
We also need to work on inclusion of women and people with vulnerabilities. It's very important.
Et qu'il faudrait renforcer le plaidoyer à ce niveau pour une représentation démocratique de ces groupes au sein des organes de gestion des élections.
And we need to fight even more to have these groups represented amidst electoral commissions.
Et aussi accompagner la mise en œuvre donc des différents consensus au niveau des acteurs.
But also to push forward for implementations of the said discussions.
Donc, permettez-moi, pour terminer, de revenir sur quelques indicateurs qui seraient importants pour renforcer la participation citoyenne.
Concluding, we need to talk about key indicators to reinforce the participation of citizens.
Je pense qu'il nous faut aller donc vers des indicateurs mesurables sur ces questions qui intègrent non seulement la participation citoyenne, mais la participation numérique.
We need measurable indicators that will indicate the participation of citizens, but also the digital participation.
Les progrès sur l'amélioration de l'intégrité.
Progress on the betterment of integrity.
Et la confiance des citoyens.
And the trust of citizens.
Et enfin sur les données désagrégées.
And finally on the different data.
Et pour terminer, donc, je voudrais juste proposer qu'il y ait une appropriation nationale donc des principes de la GNC et d'avoir un comité de suivi qui va continuer à faire ce travail-là et d'avoir un budget conséquent mais surtout un partenariat collaboratif.
And to conclude, we need to promote a partners of these electoral processes for citizens and I'm sorry, vous pouvez répéter la dernière partie? And to promote a partnership that are collaborative. Thank you.
Merci.
Merci, thank you. Okay, great. Thank you very much, Omi, for the presentation and for highlighting, for emphasizing that to promote or to enhance electoral integrity, we really need to consider the entire election process. That brings us to the second session of our discussion, where we just need to dig deeper and explore the different pieces of information that we got from our panelists. I'm going to ask questions to the panelists, and I'll get for you to respond. So I'll start with Dr. Dulani and Reverend Marco. Dr. Dulani, you stated that the data shows that only 45% of citizens believe elections enable voters to remove bad leaders. And Reverend Marco, you gave us an example of the South Africa Electoral Commission, and in your words, you say that you still think that it is one of the best in Africa, I suppose. But you also mentioned that there are external factors that are probably affecting citizen confidence in the Electoral Commission. This, to me, suggests a crisis of accountability. What is the single biggest operational change that EMBs must make to convince citizens that the system is not rigged? This is a question for both of you.
Thank you, Chair. I think if elections don't deliver on what citizens want, then the consequences are what we have seen recently in Tanzania, in Madagascar, and in some countries in West Africa, I think, where political leaders have been forced to leave office, and especially we've seen even the militaries come in. Our data in Afrobarometer also does show that there's increasing feeling among African citizens that the militaries should step in when elected leaders abuse their power. And I think that's why we've seen people on the streets in Bamako, in Ouagadougou, celebrating when the military took over. So what can we do to improve the quality of elections and bring back citizen confidence? I think one of the first things that can be done is for electoral management bodies to basically act as the people have spoken through the ballots. I think that's the basic minimum electoral management bodies can do to make sure that elections reflect what the ordinary citizens want. When electoral management bodies allow themselves to be driven by partisan interests, to be driven maybe by ethnic interests, then of course the consequences are what we're seeing, that the citizens will lose trust and confidence in them and look at alternative means to choosing leaders. It is unfortunate because at the end of the day, if people lose confidence in election management bodies, that can have cascading effects in losing confidence in the democratic process itself, when actually the problem are the people who are managing the elections rather than the democratic process itself. So I think there's quite a lot that can be done, but to bring back that public confidence is just for electoral management bodies to do what the people are saying in the ballot. Thank you.
Thank you. So 27 million people registered to vote in South Africa. So the electoral management body, they indicated that that was the highest level of registration. But there was supposed to be about 40 million people that had to register. Of the 27 million people that registered, and I mean the campaign that those guys ran, that electoral management body ran, was massive, including registration campaigns and so on. Only 17 million people turned out to vote. Now, my question, I agree with you, with what you're saying now, but there was no way in terms of the management body. I'm talking about South Africa now. I mean, I can talk about the others as well, but let me use South Africa. There's no way that this electoral management body had any influence either on the participation of the voter or their coming to the poll, or the final outcome or the results of the election. It was purely the decision of the voter that said something outside of the electoral process itself impacted on their decision to participate or not. And what was that? It's the political and social terrain. That is what it is. And so if you ask me, the system and the rigging of the system, there was no rigging of the system. In fact, when we look at the multi-party or this government of national unity, it was simply just a major shift in terms of political choices that people made from the ANC to this new party that was started, and not necessarily even to the DA itself, but that's a political discussion. When you ask me the question about the rigging, no, there wasn't any rigging or the inability of the Electoral Commission to want to rig the election, so yeah.
Okay, Tanja, you can respond.
Thank you. I find this is one of the most interesting and at the same time tricky situations we're in. I completely agree. Election management bodies, as you rightly said before, are under pressure from sometimes quite hostile political environment. So for them to come out under this pressure and create trust in the electoral process as being one of the key actors is in some circumstances actually impossible. So, but I think what they could do in most of the circumstances is to be more open with information. But that, again, comes back to political pressure, if they can or not. But this is something where the civil society can come in to also support electoral commissions to ask the government or whatever the situation is there in the political sphere to give out this information, to come forward with this information, open up on data and all kinds of different things that would create trust. And I would like to say one thing I always hear, and we also heard before, it's the setup of election commissions, how they are composed, how they are nominated. This is a problematic situation for the commission itself. But I think in this respect, we can all look to South Africa. They do have a very, very good system, which includes the public. So the public inclusion, socialization of problems, coming out with information or being able to share information also with parties, I think that's a key thing for election commissions to support trust building in electoral reform, in elections in itself.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that point, that electoral commissions need to share information with the public. Because if they don't share information with the public will assume things, and that actually leads to diminished trust. Shall we move on to the last question from me before we get questions from the floor? How do you build consensus with political actors who have no interest in it? Here I'm referring to the principle that you shared with us on political consensus building. So how do you do that, particularly in environments in bad faith environments where incumbents benefit from a broken system? How is that possible?
If I would have the answer to this question, I think we would be all much further. So no, that's actually one of the key situations we're in, how to build this confidence, how to get to consensus. And I think it can't be done by one actor, that's for sure. So that's what we came up with among all of us, also within the network. So it can't be one actor, it has to be all actors coming together. So for this matter, it's civil society, people sitting here. We have political parties, which are always left out. There is a good, there could be a good process between political parties and civil society to work on issues. If you have identified an issue, a recommendation that you want to keep up or take up, that is something to collectively bring forward. There comes a critical mass of people where even a strong holding government, let's put it that way, can't turn down again without bigger problems. So I think this is how we build this consensus. You need to take everybody along, including the population, not only NGOs or civil society organized people, also the population. That will be my first instinct, but we don't have an answer really.
Thank you. Abera and Omi, seeing that you work in regions where actors use fear, the data shows that 47% in Guinea and Uganda, those are the statistics that were shared with us. Back to the question that I shared with Tanja, how do we apply some of the principles that she suggested to us in environments where there is bad faith, where the incumbents benefit from the broken system. How would you respond to that?
Okay. There are different ways of responding to these broken systems, but the most important thing, I believe, is to, strengthen political power, political parties. If political parties are not that strong, they cannot be assertive. They will not be considered as a serious actors by the power that be. So strengthening political parties very, very important. And again, civil society must not only be educating and empowering people, they have to really be serious and should not shy away from engaging in political activities such as elections, democracy, and governance. But this also depends on the legal framework and the political space. If the political space is shrinking, then they're not able to really engage. But this is an area where they should really engage in empowering people and educating people so that they might be a voice which can be heard by those who are in power. And the media has also a role to contribute to that. If we don't engage the media and if we do not really shape the narratives to bring into reach a consensus between different actors, there would be a useless exercise. So I think the media, the civil society, and the political party, these are the major actors that should really play a role. But in order to play that role, they have to strengthen their institutional capacity. They have to build trust within the society, and they have to be also creative in order to really influence those who are in power. Confronting might not be the way which we can achieve the result. A smart way of doing things is try to really engage them without threatening those who are in power. If they are threatened, they respond in a different way. That's how I understood it.
Thank you. Omi, would you like to respond to the question? You can respond in French and then he will translate for us. You got the question? You want me to? Okay, that's fine.
Alors, brièvement, la question dit, dans un environnement où les politiciens utilisent la peur pour régner, comment pouvez-vous les approcher pour les éloigner de ce genre de méthode et trouver un agrément pour des méthodes plus paisibles, si je peux utiliser? Quels moyens suggérez-vous pour atteindre cet objectif?
Donc pour combattre l'environnement de la terreur, moi je pense qu'il faudrait parler à ces acteurs politiques. C'est vrai que tous les pays n'ont pas peut-être les mêmes références sociaux. Nous, au Sénégal, peut-être nous avons eu la chance d'avoir des chefs traditionnels, religieux et coutumiers qui peuvent parler aux différents acteurs. Dans d'autres...
Permettez-moi de répéter ce que vous avez dit. So she says the best way to give you context is to exchange with these people. For example, in Senegal, we have religious leaders, traditional leaders that can speak up rather for the population. Oui?
Et dans d'autres pays, peut-être ce n'est pas le cas, mais il faudrait renforcer les citoyens, les mouvements citoyens à prendre en charge ces questions et à faire face à ces défis de la terreur. Et pour le montrer, par exemple, dans des pays comme la Guinée ou un autre pays, peut-être qui est plus proche de nous, il faudrait, par exemple, que les mouvements citoyens puissent prendre en charge ces questions, s'organiser et affronter ces débats à travers les médias, et que aussi les médias puissent être des relais puissants pour informer l'opinion et contribuer au changement des mentalités.
So she says another way is to empower citizen movements, giving them the ability to face the current regime through dialogue and using the media, and the media as well can help spread their opinion and views. That would be another way to approach it. She gave an example of Guinea-Bissau.
Maybe 30 seconds. Yes, sure. So let me plug in here for research. Because a lot of our political parties on this continent hardly do any research whatsoever. So much that every individual thinks they would win an election. If we look at the more advanced or the more established democracies, there's usually credible research that everyone knows. When they say Boniface Dulani, is polling 2%, people have confidence in that. So much that when the elections come around and I get 1%, I wouldn't put the blame on the election management body that you rigged the election against me. So because people say, well, look, that's what you are polling. So I think we need also to put a lot more value and emphasis in research so that all the actors would at least have an idea of what is happening before we even get to the elections. Without that, we will keep on blaming each other and sharing, placing a blame on this one and that one other than ourselves.
Thank you for raising that. Research is important. I'll now open the floor for questions. Do we have questions from the floor? Yes, we have one. Do we have more questions from the floor? Two.
So you can go first. Thanks so much. My name is Godfrey Kaoma from Zambia. I work in the Office of the Vice President. I should mention that I'm not an election observer, but I'm purely a civil servant. But I work in a department called National Guidance and Religious Affairs, where we are responsible for the promotion of what we have enshrined in our Republican Constitution called National Values and Principles, which include issues of good governance and integrity, democracy, and constitutionalism. So maybe I'm not an expert in issues of election observation, but I think we are invited because we may have interest in the issues that are being discussed. So maybe my first question may go to the Afrobarometer. I heard that Zambia was cited together with Gambia, that at least we are among the highest in Africa where complete freedom of choice is high, whereby I think we have that freedom of choice in terms of our political leaders. What could be the factors that have made the Gambia and the Zambia to be among the highest? Then the second question is quite general. Any of the panelists may answer to it. I think I've been following the discussions since yesterday, where I think they are even emphasizing that the electoral process should not just end at the content, or it's the whole process. And even the observation is not just on that polling day when you do the observation. And I think somebody even mentioned about the process versus content. Now, since I'm not an expert, usually what I just see or what I read on the news, most of you observers are just very active on the actual polling day. Sometimes that's when even I see maybe SADC observers going to Zimbabwe or Tanzania, and then later on you issue your observations. So I wanted to find out where does the electoral process first start from, and maybe what role do you play as observers in this whole electoral process? Because actually many people have said that rigging actually does not happen on the actual day people are voting. Maybe it starts from obtaining of national registration cards, from even registering as the voters. So what role, so that maybe no political party, those who are competing, are disadvantaged? Because in recent past, one of our neighboring countries are here, most of the major political parties were technically knocked out even before the act of voting. Now, what active role can you do as observers so that such issues do not happen? Thanks so much. I've been questioned on time.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm Linga Mihowa from WAPE, Women's Academy for Leadership for Political Excellence. I'm the board chair. I wanted to make some comments on some of the observations that have been made by our panelists. First and foremost, let me agree with the lady from the Westminster Foundation for Democracy on the need for the electoral management bodies to be very transparent so that the citizens can have confidence in the integrity of the elections. I come from Malawi, and Professor Boniface would agree with me that our Malawi Electoral Commission started on a very bumpy road in terms of a lot of mistrusts which were around some of the commissioners, unfortunately even including the chairperson. But one of the things that happened is the mistrust that the people had in the MEC suddenly shifted, because in my view and in the view of many of the Malawians, MEC handled the election in terms of the later stages very well, in terms of really expanding their ability to reach out to people in terms of information, and that level of transparency actually made them regain the trust from the communities and the citizens, including the political parties that were at the forefront in terms of asking the MEC chairperson, the CEO, to resign. So I want to agree with you that I think Malawi has been a typical case of where the electoral management body has really been able to be trusted because of the manner in which they came out in the open to be transparent about the elections handling at the very last stage. Professor Dolani, I want to speak from the advantage of reading the Afrobarometers. You did one for Malawi, and I think you're making a very important point around how research can be used by the political parties so that there is no blame game at the end of the day. But the question is, from your perspective, how can such institutions like yours and others really build that relationship with political parties? I am not too sure what happens in between your collection of the data and your release, but all the time they are running battles in terms of parties that are scored lesser favorably in the barometer not being able to trust. But you're making an important point that if political parties and other stakeholders become more comfortable with what you do, then you really find that they'll find it more useful even for their own advantage. So is there ways in which you can actually develop programs that begin to sensitize people around the importance of the research so that it's not looked at from a point of contestation and confrontation, but from a point of appreciating that it is a knowledge product that can actually be to their benefit? So I'd like to get your views on that. The last point is the panelists from South Africa that shared that the 27 million registered and only 17 million showed up, 10 million did not. I happened to observe the elections in South Africa this year. The question for me is, how do we, or maybe the recommendation is, how do we make sure that citizens are really energized to engage with the electoral process from an electoral cycle perspective, rather than just saying that, okay, maybe it's the politics or it's the economy and we'll fix them at the ballot? Because I think for me, we have to expand ways in which citizens can actually engage with the process throughout, and really getting as many people as possible to show up for an election. Because as much as, yes, they do have a say by staying at home, but I think in terms of our democratic principles, we want as many people as possible to be able to exercise that right to vote. So any thoughts around how we can build programs, or what can actually trigger more citizens' engagement, even though they are frustrated and resented by, but really finding traction in showing up to vote? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the questions. Okay, we still have one question. That's our last question that we get. Two. Okay, two questions. Oh, Okay, another one. So we have 3 more questions. Please kindly be brief. We are running out of time.
Sure.
Thank you.
My name is Daniel Mhango. I'm coming from the People's Alliance for Change, PAC, which is a political party in Zambia. And my question directly goes to Afrobarometer, specifically Dr. Dulani. Well, in Zambia, we've had incidences where the Electoral Commission of Zambia and its electoral code of conduct is not followed in many elections. Now, you as Afrobarometers or observers, I'm sure you've monitored elections in Zambia. What is your role in such circumstances? Because evidence has been provided and we see that nothing happens. So I would like to get clarity on that. Thank you.
Okay, next question.
Yes, thank you for the presentations and especially the experiences from the various countries. For the Afrobarometer, I do agree that the confidence in electoral management bodies is dropping. But we want to know why it's dropping. Because I believe we need to ask further questions relating to the process. Voting can be free. People may not be stopped to go and vote, but does their vote count? So I think that's an aspect we really need to capture. When people go and vote, in the results management process, does the people's vote count, or they vote and something else is announced? That's one easy, I think we need to interrogate also. Because it appears electoral commissions now working to support governments to stay in power. We allow the process to go free, but when it comes to the tallying of votes, then you see the figures are cooked. And then also this issue of electoral commissions openly siding with a political party and skewing their processes to give advantage to particular political parties or candidates as against others. What can we do? What sort of collaboration do you think is required to make sure that citizens take control of their votes and their process, whilst also making sure that they are law-abiding? Because after the 2023 election in my country, we are almost going back to war because the main opposition decided to boycott governance and for 3 months refused to take the oath of office.
Thank you. Okay, one last question. Could you kindly be brief? Just ask your question and no comments, please.
Yes,
Okay,
thank you. My question goes to Tanja. You mentioned very well that democratic electoral reforms process require adequate time frame and resources. In a situation where I've got trends of government coming up with laws when you are closer to elections, for example, the constitution making process, the electoral process, and other, policies that hinge on elections. What is the best way of engaging government so that they can avoid that? Because surely you realize that citizens are lost and they feel that there's some manipulation processes that are trying to manipulate the elections. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the questions. So I'm going to defer to the panelists. As you respond to the various questions that have been asked by the audience, could you please also just give us one main recommendation that you have as your parting, word in terms of rebuilding trust and advancing reform? So you answer the question, but you also give us just one major recommendation for this particular session. Okay, so I'm going to start off. Do you want to start, Tanja? Okay, wonderful. There is the mic.
Thank you. Since it was a direct question on the finance and the resources, it would be good, and how to engage around this, it would be good to also have this in government planning already. So there is no electoral process without the need of reform, none anywhere on the globe. So what could be done is to have something set up in the budget of the government that is accounting for it, so that you already have a budget line saying something about this is for the election commission to do reform processes, to lead on them, to inform the public, and to finance us accordingly. And that would lead me to my final sentence on this great panel. It is important, and I think we heard this a few times here, the word dialogue, getting people engaged. For me, the most important thing is socializing ideas, either from the government or from the election commission or also from the side of civil society or political parties. This needs to be a public discussion. It doesn't have to be a huge one all the time, over the media and for weeks and weeks, but it needs to be a public discussion. This is what democracy is about. People need to vote for the people who they think represent what they want, and they need to make up their opinion on what they want, and for that they need information, they need evidence, as we get from the Afrobarometer side, for example, and that is very important. Have good evidence, as he suggested as well, and have a public discussion. Thank you.
Okay, so there are quite a couple of questions that came my way, but if you allow me, I can take after them, some of them afterwards. But Mr. Kauma, you raised the question about why is Zambia and Gambia, maybe apart from the fact that your names are sounding somewhat similar. Look, I think, Tanja, I think he gave us a very good overview of some of the key issues that bring a greater confidence, not only in the integrity of elections, but I would also say the election management bodies. And I think, my sister, Linga, has also highlighted, I think, the value, I think, of, people having more confidence in elections and how that can translate into confidence in the election management bodies, including it being a very transparent and professional institution. But I think there is one factor that might explain why Zambia and the Gambia in particular, the citizens give us more confidence in elections as a means to choosing leaders. And that is a turnover test. The survey in Zambia that we are presenting now was looking at the 2021 elections. And that's when we had a change from PF to UPND. And when citizens see that actually we can use our vote to change government, that gives greater confidence that this system works. But when you have the same political party in power from independence, or as our colleague from Ethiopia was telling us, or Tanzania, that gives the citizens a sense that maybe the vote doesn't matter, and therefore we need to look at alternative ways of choosing political leaders. So when you have a turnover, it's a very, very powerful tool and incentive for people to know the vote does matter, and it also means that come the next election, they can use the same vote to vote out leaders that have just been elected. And in Malawi, we've experienced that in recent months. I think, I already alluded to the question of transparency, but there was a question, I think, Linga, on what can be done to build this confidence? And I wanted to extend this discussion maybe to our development partners. I think when we look at democracy on this continent, we tend to emphasize more on civil society organizations, the electoral management bodies, other key stakeholders, and we usually don't look at political parties. We can't have democracy if we don't have democracy in our political parties. We can't have, credible elections if the political parties are not supported to have confidence in the electoral process. When I mention the issue of research, you see that research is quite expensive. Most of our political parties would not be able to afford the service that, for example, Afrobarometer does. But these surveys usually come just before an election, and you see a sputtering of surveys on the elections. And sometimes people can easily think that these have also a political agenda. If we were to make research part of the entire election process from the very beginning to the very end, then maybe we'll help to build greater confidence. But of course, researchers also, like ourselves, we need to do a better job in engaging political parties. Mr. Mhango, you asked about the Electoral Code of Conduct. I should say that Afrobarometer, we are more researchers. We are not election observers. So maybe my colleagues here might be better placed to answer and to respond to that question. But there was a question, I think, from the gentleman at the back. I didn't get your name. On the question, why is confidence in election management bodies really declining? And I think the discussions that we've had have also highlighted some of these challenges. Partisanship, lack of impartiality, lack of professionalism, and indeed accusations of election rigging, and I think where, as you rightly note, manipulating of results to suit incumbents especially, those can lead to declining confidence in election management bodies. But we also need, I think, to make sure that our elections are handled professionally. I admire, countries, the more advanced democracies, where there is not even any discussion about the election management body. People can win an election with 2 or 3 votes and no one questions the process because they have confidence that that is the true reflection of the elections. Hopefully, we can do what I think our colleagues from WFD are suggesting, to increase greater confidence in our elections by being professional, transparent, among other things. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to respond to the question, where does the observers begins to observe elections? The global principles of domestic observers or monitors clearly states out that there should be an electoral cycle, and observer groups must observe all the electoral processes, including the pre-election, the election period, and the post-election. So the pre-election period is an important period where budget is allocated for election management body, and the election management body might be starved because of the shortest, the budget, the meager budget may be allocated in order to suffocate this institution so that we will not be able to really carry out what is entrusted to it. For instance, in Nigeria, a year before the election period, the assembly approves budget, which gives the leverage for the election management body to prepare ahead of time. So the budget area must be observed. That is the starting point again. A review of the past performance is part of the pre-election phase. We should be also observed by observers. And the legal framework, where the outcome of the election will be determined. When the law is passed, is the end of the story. And the voting day will be endorsement of that outcome. So these areas must be observed. So we have to, as an observer group, we have to observe the pre-election phase, the election period, and the post-election. So it is electoral cycle approach, which is advised, and we should be followed by election observer group. Otherwise, it would be, a partial observation. It doesn't give the full picture of the process. The second one is a recommendation. My suggestion is ensuring MBs operate. As independence of MBs must be ensured. So we have to work towards that and through different means. So if we guarantee the MP's independence, all the trust issues, at least most of the trust issues will be addressed. So I personally recommend that we have to work toward this, ensuring the independence of the election management body. Thank you.
Let me just finish quickly on the question of how citizens can perform better. We normally work on the principle of political parties have their campaigns and have their manifestos. That's what we work on. And so while there is a strong emphasis on the part of electoral management bodies to ensure that people get registered and their names are on the voters' roll, there's not a strong enough emphasis on actually doing an analysis and beginning to measure what political parties say over against what they did. So if you can measure that as well, you can begin to provide information that can enable citizens to make more competent decisions. And I think so. There's a major gap in that one. So I go and I register, but I also have a choice not to vote, because the influences around me, and particularly the things on the ground, really impacts on the way in which I make a final decision on the morning that I have to cast my vote. So two things. One, we need to put maybe a little bit more pressure on political parties in terms of their manifestos, to begin to live those manifestos beyond the actual election itself. And then, colleagues, my last quick word is I sat and played around with, and I'm just going to mention it quickly. I think we need to have citizens that are generally much more connected. And I'll tell you what I mean. In 1994, everybody was an observer. Every citizen at the polling station was also an observer of that electoral process. That's why we could have volunteers. So I listen with a smile when people say we need to get volunteers. Now people don't even regard observation as a citizen activity. They regard it as a professional little outfit. So that agency, citizens and people reconnecting and owning that process, I think that's important. And that is what I call agency. The second one is leadership. I think there must be a much stronger representation and also presentation, presence of leadership that is not only located. I mean, I find it ludicrous to see how political leaders think they are the leaders. We vote them into power. We can also vote them out of power. Leadership is located in knowledge and so many other things. So leadership is the second important thing, and that's the L, A-L. Second L is literacy. And the earlier discussion about AI and all of that information, we're living in a generation that lives on short bites of information. And so we need to acknowledge and we need to communicate differently. Literacy is important. It's a different way of communicating. And then there's what I call not only literacy, but education and engagement. We need to find, and that's my E, so it is A-L-L-I-E, education and engagement. And then the last one, we need to find a nuance in how we think and how we develop and work towards the future. And I think observer groups and generally citizen groups are critical in that space. I call it ALIEN. That's my acronym, ALIEN.
Je voulais juste faire une recommandation. Je pense qu'en tant qu'organisation de la société civile, entre deux élections, nous devons pouvoir se constituer comme des médiateurs pour pouvoir anticiper sur des questions qui peuvent différencier les acteurs politiques. Et ceci dit que nous devons en tout cas contribuer à la création d'espaces de dialogue entre acteurs politiques, les citoyens, les parties prenantes, les autorités publiques pour avoir des consensus. Aujourd'hui,
Just an instant. So my recommendation would be, as a civil society organization, that in between two elections we might work hard to be a mediator between the citizens, the political actors, and all other key stakeholders.
Je disais qu'aujourd'hui, en Afrique de l'Ouest, par exemple, il y a la question du parrainage citoyen qui divise la classe politique. Parce que le système peut être bon pour certains, ne pas être bon pour d'autres. Et nous avons un rôle à jouer parce que c'est nouveau, mais c'est bon pour pouvoir aussi, comme filtre, voir qui est citoyen, qui ne l'est pas. C'est intéressant. Mais il faudrait peut-être que dans l'approche, que les acteurs puissent s'entendre sur comment le faire.
Noted. So we have a situation, for example, in the western side, where systems in place might be advantageous to some and to others. So we need to play that key role of mediator, if I may say.
Thank you very much. Allow me at this point to thank the panelists. Thank you to Dr. Marco. Thank you to Dr. Dulani, Umi, Reverend Marco. Thank you, Tanja. Thank you, Abera. Thank you so much for your inputs. I think this was very, very helpful. I think the discussion was lively. And thank you to all of you for choosing breakout room 3. We really appreciate that you sat through the whole discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. The banner is outside. Should we go with the banner? I'll carry them.